A simple seal woman whispered a command to her dog. What the judge did next went viral. In the quiet hush of a crowded courtroom, where the air was thick with tension and every breath seemed to echo, a woman in a simple navy dress stood. Her posture was steady, her hands calm, but her eyes carried a depth that only a few could recognize. She was no ordinary woman. Years of discipline and silent sacrifice had carved into her a strength that did not need to be announced. She was a seal, one of the few women to ever endure and conquer the crucible of that training. Yet here, she wasn't cloaked in combat gear or surrounded by her brothers in arms. She stood alone, in front of a skeptical judge and a restless gallery, with only her loyal dog at her side. The dog was no ordinary companion. Its coat gleamed with discipline, its eyes never leaving the woman, as if waiting for the slightest signal. The animal radiated calm, yet readiness, like a shadow trained to move only when called. Whispers filled the gallery. Some doubted her story, some dismissed her as dramatic. Others leaned forward, curious, sensing there was more beneath her stillness. But she ignored them all. Her gaze was locked on the judge, who studied her with the cold detachment of someone who believed he had seen every trick, every plea, every performance. The tension broke when she bent ever so slightly, her lips brushing near the dog's ear. No one heard the word she whispered. It wasn't a command shouted in the open. It was barely breath, a tone so soft it melted into silence. Yet the dog's reaction was instant. With precise obedience, it rose and walked to the center of the courtroom. The gallery hushed, eyes widened, murmurs died. The dog stopped, sat, and turned toward the defense table, directly at the man on trial. The accused had been stone-faced until that moment, but now his composure cracked. Beads of sweat shone on his forehead, his hands tightened on the table, and his jaw clenched as if the dog had stripped away every layer of false confidence he had worn. The judge shifted in his seat. His gavel, idle for most of the proceedings, now trembled in his hand. He leaned forward, his voice lower than before. "What exactly did you tell him to do?" he asked. Her reply was calm, almost weightless. "I asked him to recognize the truth." The dog did not bark, did not lunge. It simply stared, unyielding, unblinking, at the man who moments before had denied everything. The silence in the courtroom became unbearable. And then, as though the pressure had become too great, the accused erupted. His voice cracked, words spilling out like poison he could no longer contain. He confessed. He confessed to everything. The courtroom gasped. The judge, who had heard countless testimonies and weighed mountains of evidence in his career, sat frozen. His eyes flicked between the trembling man and the silent dog, then returned to the woman who stood without pride, without boast, as if this was simply another mission carried out with precision. Slowly, he removed his glasses, placed them on the desk, and leaned back in his chair. His voice, usually stern and clipped, softened to something that carried weight far beyond law. "This is not about evidence. This is about truth," he said, each word deliberate. And today, truth did not come from this bench. It came from a bond stronger than any lie, a bond between a warrior and her companion. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. Phones flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Strangers rose to their feet. Within hours, the moment spread far beyond the courtroom. Across screens, across cities, across nations, the image of a simple seal woman, whispering to her dog, igniting a confession, burned itself into the world's memory. What the judge did next sealed the story into history. He stood, breaking every layer of tradition and formality, and bowed his head toward her. Not as a judge to a witness, not as authority to subordinate, but as one warrior recognizing another. That gesture, the bow of respect, went viral. For days, people replayed it. Not just the command, not just the dog's piercing stare, but the acknowledgement that sometimes truth is found in silence, in loyalty, in the invisible strength between a woman and her companion. And though she never sought the spotlight, the world saw her for what she was, a warrior who carried her battles not in noise or violence, but in whispered power that could shatter even the hardest walls of deceit. The silence that followed the confession was unlike anything the courtroom had ever known. It wasn't the hush of order restored by the bang of a gavel, nor the quiet of people waiting for the next line of evidence to be read. This silence was alive, a living thing wrapping around every throat, pressing into every chest. It was the silence of truth finally exposed, the silence of walls collapsing. The accused, a man who had walked into the courtroom with arrogance carved into every step, now slumped in his chair, unable to meet the gaze of the dog that still sat in perfect stillness. The woman didn't move, didn't smile, didn't allow herself even a flicker of triumph. Her training had taught her that victory was not in celebration but in the still moment after, when the mission was complete and the cost had yet to be measured. She reached down, her fingers brushing the soft fur behind the dog's ear. The animal did not break its stance, but a faint tremor of its tail revealed the acknowledgement of her touch. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead, his thoughts whirling. He had spent decades in that courtroom. He had sentenced murderers, heard elaborate lies, listened to broken families. But never, never, had he seen truth drag itself from the throat of a man because of something invisible, something whispered, something that reached beyond the scope of the law. He looked at the woman again, at her plain navy dress, her unadorned face, her quiet strength. There was no hunger for recognition in her eyes, only the unshakable calm of someone who had walked through fire before and expected to do so again. "Order," he finally said, though his voice cracked under the weight of the moment. The gavel tapped, softer than usual, as if even the judge feared shattering the sacred stillness that lingered. He looked at the jury, their eyes wide, their expressions stunned. He looked at the gallery, where people had forgotten to breathe, their hands hovering midair with pens, phones, or notebooks. Then he looked at the accused, who sat like a crumbled statue, the mask stripped from his face. "Record the confession," the judge ordered, his tone stronger now, reclaiming the authority of the bench. But inside, he knew authority had shifted. For the first time in his long career, he understood that his courtroom was not the sole stage of justice. Sometimes, justice arrived quietly, without permission, carried in the bond between two beings who spoke a language the rest of the world could barely comprehend. The bailiff stepped forward, cautious as though entering holy ground. He led the accused away, the man's knees buckling as if every step carried the weight of his own words. The dog followed with its eyes but didn't move until the woman gave a subtle flick of her fingers. Only then did it rise, heel perfectly, and sit by her side once more. The gallery erupted again. Not in chaos, but in applause, an unusual breach of decorum the judge allowed to unfold. He did not silence them. He let the sound wash over. The woman, though she seemed unmoved. Applause had never been her reward. Recognition had never been her desire. The only acknowledgement she sought was the unspoken trust of her companion and the quiet assurance that she had done what was necessary. The judge leaned forward, his voice lower, almost reverent. "I must ask, though the court is adjourned, what was that command? What language did you use?" She looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing whether he deserved an answer. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of pride but of remembrance. "It wasn't language," she said softly. "It was memory." The judge frowned, puzzled, but she didn't explain further. Instead, she reached down, stroking the dog's head. In that moment, fragments of her past flashed before her, memories she carried like scars etched deep beneath the skin. Years earlier, before the courtroom, before the silence of whispered commands, there had been chaos. There had been fire and night raids, stormed compounds and the metallic scent of war. She had been the quiet shadow on missions no one admitted existed, the woman whose presence was doubted until she proved herself beyond doubt. They had said no woman could endure the training, no woman could carry the weight of a seal. But she had endured, not because she wanted glory but because she carried something heavier than failure. She carried the memory of her father, himself a soldier who had fallen in service, leaving her with nothing but his dog tags and the promise that courage meant rising even when the world pushed you down. It was during her second deployment that she met the animal that would one day sit at her side in a courtroom. A half-starved dog found in the ruins of a bombed-out village, its ribs visible, its eyes fierce with survival. The others had dismissed it as a stray, too wild to tame. But she saw something in those eyes, a reflection of her own hunger, her own fight. She fed him scraps, taught him patience, gave him a name whispered only between them. Slowly, he became more than a dog. He became her shadow, her ally, the one presence she trusted when trust was scarce. They trained together. He learned her signals, not the loud commands others barked but the subtle ones, gestures so small they were invisible to those who weren't watching closely. He learned her voice not in volume but in tone, the low hum she used when silence was essential. In the years that followed, they became inseparable. Missions succeeded not because of brute force, but because of precision, the unspoken bond between soldier and dog, memory and survival. And now, here in a courtroom far from the deserts and jungles where their bond was forged, she had used that same bond not for combat but for truth. The whisper had not been a word at all. It had been a memory, a vibration that recalled the long nights where life depended on silence and obedience. It was the same whisper she had used to tell him to wait, to hold, to trust. He had carried that memory into the present, responding with the stillness that broke a liar's courage. The judge studied her, realizing that what had unfolded wasn't a trick or performance. It was something pure, forged in places beyond law and order. And in that realization, he did the unthinkable. He rose from his bench, the heavy robe shifting around him, and bowed his head toward her. It wasn't a deep bow, but it was enough. Enough to silence the gallery once more, enough to etch the moment into the collective memory of all who witnessed it. That gesture spread faster than the confession itself. By evening, videos flooded the internet. People saw not just a woman and a dog, not just a judge breaking tradition, but a moment of reverence in a world starved of it. Commentators dissected it, veterans wept at it, families found hope in it. For once, the viral story wasn't born from scandal or spectacle but from truth, loyalty, and respect. She returned home that night in the same plain dress, her dog walking calmly beside her. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones reached out like grasping hands. But she offered nothing more than a nod, a polite, no comment, and slipped away. She lived in a small house by the edge of the woods, a place where silence still lived, where the hum of the wind through trees reminded her of the nights she had once endured. She sat on the porch, her dog resting at her feet, the glow of the television inside carrying fragments of the day's events. She ignored most of it, but one clip caught her ear, the judge's voice, carried across the world. Today, truth was not demanded, it was revealed. And it came from a place far beyond this courtroom. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wooden chair. The dog sighed, its chest rising and falling in rhythm with her own breathing. For her, it wasn't about virality. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the mission, completed, clean, without glory or noise. She whispered once more, the same tone she had used in the courtroom, the same tone she had used in the ruins of war. The dog lifted its head, ears alert, eyes locking onto hers with unshakable trust. And in that simple exchange, the world's noise fell away, leaving only the bond that no lie could ever break. The days that followed blurred into something she had never prepared for. Combat zones had taught her to anticipate ambushes, to read shadows, to sense danger before it revealed itself. But this relentless flood of attention, was a battlefield of its own. News vans lined the road that curved toward her home, their lights cutting into the night like flares over enemy territory. Reporters camped at the edges of her driveway, their voices calling her name, their questions sharp, hungry, insistent. She ignored them all. She had not lived her life for spectacle, and she would not begin now. She slipped out before dawn for her runs with the dog, his paws striking the earth in rhythm with her own steps. They moved as shadows through the mist, avoiding the lenses, the chatter, the noise. To the world, she had become a symbol. To herself, she remained what she had always been, a soldier who never asked for recognition, a woman who carried silence like armor. But silence was difficult to keep when the world demanded a story. Veterans reached out, writing letters of gratitude, saying her bond with the dog reminded them of their own battles, their own companions. Families wrote of hope, of how truth had finally triumphed in a courtroom where they thought lies always won. Children sent drawings of her and the dog, crude sketches of loyalty etched in crayon. The judge, meanwhile, found himself restless in ways he hadn't felt in decades. The bow had been instinct, not strategy. Something in her presence had demanded respect, stripped away the trappings of authority, and left him bare before her truth. Yet, as days passed, he realized the weight of that moment was heavier than he anticipated. His colleagues questioned him, some mocking, some admiring. Newspapers debated whether his act was weakness or courage. But in the quiet of his chambers, he replayed the image of her standing there, silent, steady, her dog at her side, and wondered what justice truly meant. For the first time in his long career, he doubted whether the law alone could ever contain it. One evening, long after the courthouse emptied, the judge remained behind, sitting in the glow of a single lamp. His robe hung across the chair like a discarded skin. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, though he barely touched it, lost in thought. The gavel sat idle before him, its surface scarred from years of striking. He remembered the woman's words. It wasn't language. It was memory. They had settled into him like a seed, growing roots that twisted through his thoughts. What memories did she carry that gave her such power in a whisper? What scars had forged that unshakable bond with the animal that obeyed silence better than most obeyed command? He needed to know, not for curiosity, but because he sensed in her a truth that could change him, perhaps even redeem the hollowness that years of routine had carved into him. The decision was uncharacteristic, almost reckless. Judges didn't step into the lives of those who appeared before them. But he found himself writing a letter, longhand, careful, formal yet human. He addressed it not to Ms. or witness, but simply to her name. He thanked her, not for the spectacle, but for reminding him that justice had a soul. He asked, humbly, if she would allow him to visit, to speak not as judge and witness, but as two people who had seen the fragility of truth. She received the letter 2 mornings later. The envelope was plain, the handwriting steady but aged. She read it once, then again, her dog watching her with eyes that seemed to question her hesitation. She had spent her life avoiding entanglements, keeping distance, protecting silence. And yet, there was something in his words that resonated, not with vanity, but with recognition. He was a man bound by rules, yet he had bowed, an act of humility rare in men of his station. Perhaps he deserved the courtesy of an answer. That evening, she penned a short reply. She agreed, but with one condition. The meeting would be private, without cameras, without noise, without the world intruding. She gave him a time, a place, the old war memorial on the edge of town, where names of the fallen were etched into stone, where silence still held authority. When the day arrived, she wore the same navy dress, as though to remind herself that she was not stepping into another battlefield, but neither was she stepping into vanity. Her dog padded beside her, ears alert, his stride measured. The memorial loomed ahead, cold stone bathed in golden light of the setting sun. She stood there, waiting, her hand resting lightly on the dog's head. The judge arrived minutes later, not in his robe, not with the weight of authority, but as a man in a simple suit, carrying nothing but the heaviness of his own questions. He paused when he saw her, bowing his head once more, not deep, but enough. She inclined hers in return. "Thank you," he began, his voice quieter than it had ever been in the courtroom. "I had to see you, not as a judge, but as a man who once believed the law was the only truth." Her eyes studied him, calm but piercing. "And now I wonder if truth lives deeper than words, deeper than rulings." He looked at the dog, then back at her. "What I saw in that courtroom, it wasn't law. It was something I cannot name." She was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting to the etched names on the stone wall. "You saw loyalty," she said at last. "You saw memory. Law may bind men, but loyalty unmasks them." That's why he confessed. Not because I asked him. Because the dog demanded truth in a language he couldn't escape. The judge swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "And where did you learn such mastery?" Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained steady. "You don't master it, you suffer it. You endure until bond is the only thing that remains. That dog and I survived places where men fell. We carried silence together. We learned that obedience isn't born of fear, it's born of trust. That's what you witnessed. Not mastery, not power, trust." The word struck him with force. For years, he had wielded authority like a shield, demanding obedience from the bench, assuming fear equaled respect. Now, in front of this woman and her dog, he saw how fragile that was. Trust, not fear, carried true weight. They stood there in silence for a while, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of names etched in stone. Finally, the judge spoke again, his voice lower. "The world has made you a symbol. Do you resent it?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. The world always wants symbols. But I am not a symbol. I am a soldier. I am a woman who whispered to her dog. Nothing more. The judge nodded, though deep inside he knew she was wrong. She was more. Not because she sought it, but because the world needed her to be. As twilight deepened, they parted. He returned to his chambers with a heart both heavier and lighter, carrying her words like scripture. She returned to her home, where silence welcomed her once more. But the world beyond their private meeting roared louder than ever. The viral moment had spread beyond borders. Military academies studied the footage, calling it an example of command presence beyond rank. Psychologists debated the depth of human-animal bonds. Philosophers wrote essays on truth, memory, and loyalty. Even politicians, eager for their own slice of reflected glory, tried to weave her story into their speeches. She ignored them all. She didn't care for theories or speeches. She only cared for the quiet, for the bond she carried, for the dog at her side. But fame is not a tide that recedes easily. One morning, she found an envelope at her door, sealed with the crest of the Department of Defense. Inside was an invitation. No, a request, for her to speak at a gathering of cadets. They wanted her to tell her story, to inspire, to remind the next generation of warriors what loyalty meant. She folded the letter, placed it on the table, and stared out the window for a long time. She had left that world behind. She had given enough. And yet, she thought of the young faces who might one day walk into the same fires she had endured. Perhaps they needed more than weapons. Perhaps they needed memory. That night, as she sat on the porch with her dog, she whispered once more, the same tone as always. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and his eyes locked onto hers. She smiled faintly. One more mission, she murmured. And the dog, as always, understood. The auditorium smelled faintly of polished wood and pressed uniforms. Rows of cadets filled the space, their shoulders squared, their eyes restless with ambition and impatience. They had been told this day was special, that someone would speak to them unlike anyone they had heard before. Most assumed it would be another decorated officer, perhaps a general weighed down with medals. But when the door opened and the woman stepped inside in her simple navy dress, with her dog at her side, a ripple of confusion passed through the room. She moved without hesitation, her stride steady, her chin neither high nor low, simply level. The dog padded beside her, its eyes scanning the crowd as if weighing every face, every heart, every hidden doubt. The cadets shifted, whispering among themselves, but the whispers quieted when the commandant himself stood and offered her the podium with a salute. She returned no salute, only a nod, before turning to face the room. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on the dog's head, grounding herself, feeling the steady rhythm of breath beneath her fingers. The silence stretched, uneasy, until the cadets realized it was intentional. She wasn't searching for words. She was waiting for them to stop fidgeting, stop assuming, stop underestimating. Only when the silence was thick enough to command did she begin. "You've been told I'm here to inspire you," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying easily to the back of the hall. "That isn't why I came." The cadets straightened, exchanging glances. "I came to tell you the truth," she continued. "And the truth is not medals. It's not parades. It's not the shine on your boots or the weight of your rank. The truth is nights so long you think the sun has forgotten you. It's hunger. It's fear. It's the silence when no one is coming to save you but yourself and the one who refuses to leave your side." Her hand brushed the dog's ear. The animal lifted its head higher, eyes fixed forward, as if remembering those nights too. "You've been taught commands, loud, sharp, absolute. You think power is in the volume of your voice. But I'll tell you what breaks men. What unmasks lies. What holds the line when everything else falls apart." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing the rose. "It's not the shout. It's the whisper. It's the bond that needs no noise." The cadets sat frozen, the weight of her words sinking deeper than any manual or lecture they had ever heard. She began to walk slowly across the stage, the dog following at perfect heel. "I once stood in a courtroom," she said, "where a man believed he could lie his way to freedom. I whispered to my dog. Not a word, not a command, but a memory. He sat, still as stone, staring into that man's soul. And the man broke. He confessed. Not because the law forced him, but because loyalty stripped him bare. Murmurs swept the room, cadets leaning forward now, caught between awe and disbelief. That bond, she said, her voice softer now, was forged in ruins, in blood, in nights when only silence could keep us alive. You will never understand it in full until you suffer it. But remember this, trust will carry you further than fear. And loyalty will unmask what authority never can. She stopped, turning to face them fully. So don't ask yourselves how loud you can shout. Ask yourselves who will still stand beside you when you whisper. The hall erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the thunder of young souls struck by something raw, something true. Even the commandant, who had heard countless speeches, found his throat tightening, his eyes burning with pride he could not fully name. At the back of the room, unseen by most, the judge sat in silence. He had come in plain clothes, slipping in quietly, not as a figure of authority but as a man who needed to hear her again. As her words echoed through the hall, he felt the same weight he had felt in his courtroom, the same piercing truth. He realized then that she wasn't simply speaking to cadets, she was speaking to him too. When the applause finally died, she offered nothing more. She did not linger, did not bask in the admiration. She gave a simple nod, turned, and walked out, her dog at her side. The cadets rose instinctively, not ordered, but compelled, standing as if in the presence of something sacred. Outside, the air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of crimson fading into indigo. She breathed deeply, relieved to leave the noise behind. But as she descended the steps, the judge approached, his hat in his hands, his expression torn between gratitude and hesitation. You spoke as if you've carried those cadets with you all your life, he said quietly. She regarded him with steady eyes. I spoke as if I once was them. Hungry, blind, believing strength was volume. I learned otherwise. He nodded, his throat tight. You may have changed them forever. Her lips curved faintly. That's not why I spoke. I know, he said, almost whispering. That's why it mattered. They stood there in silence, the dog sitting between them, tail flicking once against the stone step. Finally, she inclined her head and walked away, vanishing into the evening as quietly as she had entered the cadets' world. But the ripples did not vanish. Within weeks, her words spread beyond the academy. Videos of her speech, leaked despite the commandant's attempt to protect its privacy, raced across the internet. Soldiers in distant bases played her words before missions. Teachers used them in classrooms to explain trust and resilience. Families repeated them at dinner tables. Even corporate leaders quoted her, awkwardly trying to capture a piece of her gravity. She ignored the noise, retreating deeper into her quiet life. Yet she could not stop the tide. Letters came by the dozens, then hundreds, thanking her, pleading with her, asking her to speak again. She turned them all away, save for one. It came from the widow of a soldier whose name was etched on the memorial. The woman wrote of her husband's loyalty, of the silence he had carried, of how she wished the world could see soldiers not as heroes in uniforms, but as human beings bound by trust and memory. You gave me words I could not give my children, the widow wrote. You gave me silence that speaks. That letter she folded carefully, placing it beside her father's dog tags on the wooden table. For the first time, she allowed herself to weep, her tears falling into the fur of the dog resting at her feet. He did not stir, only pressed closer, the steady weight of his presence anchoring her to the ground. Meanwhile, the judge found himself called to speak at a national symposium on justice. Normally, he would have given a lecture on precedent, case law, the careful machinery of courts. But this time, as he stood before his peers, he said something different. I have spent my life believing the gavel was the loudest sound of justice, he said. But I learned that justice is not always a sound. Sometimes it is a whisper. Sometimes it is the stare of loyalty that no lie can withstand. I bowed once in my courtroom, not to weakness, but to truth that was greater than law. The room fell into silence, his colleagues stunned, unsettled, but undeniably moved. In that moment, he carried her words further than she would have ever chosen, reshaping minds not through rulings, but through humility. And somewhere, far from the symposium's applause, the woman sat on her porch again, whispering to her dog as the stars scattered themselves across the night. She did not know how far her words had traveled, nor did she care. All she knew was the bond that remained, unbroken, between her and the one who had never abandoned her. That was enough. Always enough. The tide of attention refused to ebb. No matter how many invitations she turned down, no matter how often she retreated into the woods with her dog, the world pressed closer. Officials wanted her voice at ceremonies. Veterans wanted her presence at gatherings. Academies wanted her wisdom woven into their curriculum. She remained silent, guarding the sanctuary of her life, until a request arrived unlike any other. It wasn't stamped with a crest or written with formality. It was handwritten, simple, on paper that bore the tremor of age. It came from the judge. He wrote of a summit, an unprecedented gathering of judges, military leaders, and civic officials who wanted to explore what justice meant in a world fraying at its edges. He wrote not to command, not even to ask, but to confess. Your silence taught me more than the law has in 40 years, he wrote. If you will not come for them, come for me. I need to hear you once more, before my time ends. The honesty in his words pierced her defenses. This was not the noise of politicians or the flattery of institutions. Seeking truth in a world that had offered him only procedure. She could not refuse. The summit was held in a vast hall in the capital, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers, flags hanging heavy against the walls. The room swelled with power, robes of judges, medals of generals, suits of officials. They expected a lecture, a framework, a polished speech. What they received was a woman in the same navy dress, walking to the center with her dog, unadorned, unhurried. She did not approach the podium. Instead, she stopped in the open space, the dog sitting at her side, eyes fixed on her. The hall quieted, curiosity sharpening into focus. You gather here with power, she began, her voice steady, unamplified yet reaching every corner of the hall. Power in your robes, your ranks, your offices. You believe power is authority. You believe justice is procedure. You believe loyalty is command. But you are wrong. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. I stood in ruins once, she said, her hand brushing the dog's head. And in those ruins, rank meant nothing. Law meant nothing. Procedure meant nothing. What remained was loyalty. What remained was memory. What remained was silence stronger than fear. That silence broke lies in a courtroom. That silence stripped a man bare. That silence bowed a judge. The judge, seated near the front, bowed his head again, unashamed, his eyes glistening. She continued, her voice lower, fiercer. You sit here with laws and doctrines, but ask yourselves this, when truth hides, will your words unmask it? Or will it take a whisper, a bond, a loyalty you cannot legislate? If you cannot answer, then your power is noise. And noise cannot hold a world together. The hall was silent now, not out of respect alone but out of conviction. She turned, meeting eyes row by row, her gaze steady, piercing, unforgiving. You want me to be a symbol, she said. But I am not a symbol. I am proof. Proof that justice is not written, but lived. Proof that truth does not bow to noise, but to loyalty. Remember that the next time you strike your gavel, the next time you send soldiers into fire, the next time you sign your name to a decision that will shape lives. She paused then, kneeling beside the dog, her hand resting lightly on his neck. This is my last whisper, she said. The rest is yours. And with that, she rose and walked out, the dog at her side, leaving the hall stunned into silence that no applause dared to break. The judge remained seated long after the others stirred, tears glistening on his cheeks. He knew then his career was complete, not because of the rulings he had written, but because he had witnessed truth that transcended law. News of her words spread as everything she touched did, but this time she did not return to find crowds at her door. For the first time, the world seemed to understand her silence. They did not chase her. They listened. Schools recited her words. Soldiers carried them into battle. Judges quoted them in decisions. And slowly, a shift began. Not in laws alone, but in hearts. Back in her small home by the woods, life returned to its rhythm. She rose at dawn, ran with her dog, whispered when silence demanded. She received letters still, but fewer now, and she answered only one. It was from the judge. His health had declined, and he wrote of his nearing end with the same honesty he had written before. I will go soon, he said. But I go with peace, because I saw truth bow neither to me nor to law, but to something greater. Thank you. She folded the letter, placed it beside the widow's, and lit a candle. That night she whispered to her dog, and as he lifted his head, she felt her father's memory, the widow's grief, the judge's humility, all bound in the silence they shared. The candle burned low. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that was not a word but a memory. A whisper that would outlast her, outlast the dog, outlast even the judge. For truth once revealed in silence never dies. It lives in every bond of loyalty, in every unshakable stare, in every whisper that unmasks a lie. And so the story of the simple seal woman and her dog became not just viral, not just history, but memory, etched into the silence of a world that finally listened. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.